All right, clock on the pew says it is that time. And we'll get ready to get started here. I appreciate Freddie stepping in last week while we took a little run up to Boston. I would recommend, if you ever have the chance and have not been there, to visit the city of Boston. It's a really neat place. If you're a history person, there is an amazing amount of history that you can see and relive and learn about. One of the neat things, when we went by the Old South Church, and I'll try to get a picture or two put in my PowerPoint next week to show you, but the layout of the church there was such, there were pews and there were what we would call box seats, where a family could go in and there was a square-like pew along it, and you could go in and close the door. And the pews even had doors on each end. Well, that was so that when they went to church back in that time, they could close the door and the kids couldn't get out. So they could confine the kids to their particular pew. It was also interesting to find out that the box seat type layout for these box areas, people paid for their church seats. If they wanted to sit in these particular seats with a certain vantage point, they paid. And there was someone at the church who noted who was supposed to get what box seats. And just so the next time that when you think the preacher's going a little long at church, anybody want to guess how long the average service was back in the day when they were attending the Old South Church? You cheated because you saw it. 6 hours. Church was 6 hours. They went for 3 hours, took a break, and they went for 3 more. And let me tell you, if you sat on those pews, you wonder how they survived an hour, much less 3. Because they weren't soft and they were straight backed. So I'll try to put a couple of pictures beginning next week so you can see it, but it was really neat. We had a really great trip. For those who saw my pictures on Facebook, we ate very well too. There's a lot of great food in Boston. All right, prayer list. And I know there is a lot going on. Look at here who's coming rolling in. Of course, Lena Bickers has now gotten a diagnosis of bladder cancer, and they are working for a treatment plan for her. Linda Winstead's surgery date is now set for August 23rd. Wes Parker recovering from hip replacement. I told Pete when I walked in, I didn't know Wes was even going to have that done until after it was done. I saw Caroline Stallings coming in a while ago with a cast on her arm. She broke her arm. And Michael Scott, been diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. Vonda Gates, who used to attend here, has been diagnosed with stage 4 melanoma. So we have a lot on the prayer list. Anything I missed there, or any updates or anything else we need to know about? August 5th, last one. Hopefully we'll get that done and get you in a marathon before long, huh? Anything else? Any updates? Let's see. Tim and Simi are due back next week. Okay. They'll be back here next Sunday, but do they get back one day this week sometime? Okay. They've been gone to Ghana, and hopefully they've had a really good trip and gotten a lot done. All right, if nothing else, Pete, if you'll get us started with prayer. Thanks, sir. All right, we are rolling on in our To the Point look at the Gospel of Mark. Mark chapter 8. We're going to start right there, beginning of verse 1 today. Mark chapter 8. And we're going to talk a good bit about spiritual blindness. Problem they had back in that day, and probably problem we still have some today. But we're going to talk about spiritual blindness, and we're going to start Mark 8. Let's look at verses 1 through 10. Mark 8, verses 1 through 10. And it reads, "In those days there was again a large crowd, and they had nothing to eat. He called the disciples and said to them, 'I have compassion on the crowd because they've already stayed with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they will collapse on the way, and some of them have come a long distance.' His disciples answered him, 'Where can anyone get enough bread here in this desolate place to feed these people?' 'How many loaves do you have?' he asked them. 'Seven,' they said. He commanded the crowd to sit down on the ground. Taking the 7 loaves, he gave thanks, broke them, and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. So they served them to the crowd. They also had a few small fish, and after he blessed them, he said these were to be served as well. They ate and were satisfied. Then they collected 7 large baskets of leftover pieces. About 4,000 were there. He dismissed them, and he immediately got into the boat with his disciples and went to the district of Dalmanutha." So, another big crowd, and we were talking about how long church was at the Old South Church in Boston. How long does it say these have been with Jesus here? 3 days. 3 days they've been. You know, some of us today, Tim goes 15 minutes long, we're like, oh, that was long, I can't get up and move. These people have been hanging around Jesus now for 3 days listening to his teaching. And we're going to talk here about Jesus satisfies. That is a screenshot from out of the Chosen. But here we have the setting of where the people are hungry. We get bread, we get fish, and we feed a large crowd. Jesus takes care, and it says he had compassion on them. They had been there listening to him for 3 days, and he said, I can't send these people away. They haven't had anything to eat. So again, we see the compassion of Jesus for those who've been listening to his teaching. And again, the disciples question how feeding so many people out in the wilderness could be possible with what little they have. What does this say about the memory of the 12 here? Because haven't we just gone through this not long ago? My memory's so bad I could plan my own surprise party. We just had, not long before, Jesus had an instance of where they had very little. Jesus took it and blessed it, and he fed a large crowd, and there were leftovers, abundantly fed. And here are the disciples again going, well, there's a lot of people. How are we going to feed them? Where's your memory here? Did you forget what he had just done? For his disciples answered him, where can anyone get enough bread here in this desolate place to feed these people? Makes you think, you wonder if Jesus looked at them like this. What? Really? Did you forget what I did? You wonder if Jesus looked at them and just said, huh? Because they ask, where is the food? And Jesus turns and he doesn't fire back at them. He just says, how many loaves do you have? Now, the disciples had forgotten what he had done. My question here is, do we ever forget the greatness of the things Jesus has done for us and in turn forget the things that he can still do for us? Does that ever happen to us? Have we ever asked God to handle something or help us with something? He does, and then we wonder the next time that we find ourselves in this situation, well, can God even help me out of this? Do we forget the things that he's done and in turn forget the great things he can still do? I mean, you look at the disciples here, this is what's happened. They apparently just completely forgot that he had already taken care of an almost identical situation. And now they're like, how are we going to feed these people? Well, didn't you see that Jesus took very little and turned it into a whole lot and everybody got fed? And bring that forward to us. Do we ever find ourselves forgetting what God just did for us and thinking he can't do it? Or we forget and we miss out on some great things he could do for us. I saw this, and this sort of reminds me and makes me think here of the disciples. Of some people just don't get it no matter how many times you explain it to them. And we're not talking here just about the instance of feeding two large crowds. How many times through the Gospels do we see instances of where the disciples just seem to forget what he just told them? Or what he maybe mentioned to them earlier? Or let's take this back to Exodus and the people of Israel. Do they fit under this statement? Sometimes they don't get it no matter how many times you explain it to them. How many times as they're fleeing Egypt and they're headed for the promised land, that God does things for them, gets them through situations, and how long does it take them to forget it? Not very long. God explains it to them, tells them everything, and then gone. And here again, with this situation here, with Jesus and the disciples, he's shown them all the great things he can do, all the wonderful things that he is capable of and who he is. And they're still going, how are we going to feed these people? One writer said the spiritual dullness of the disciples has been displayed a few times in Mark's gospel, and please consider that this is exactly what is being displayed again. Spiritual dullness is on display. In fact, please think about how much this parallels the life of Israel in the wilderness. God's power, his might, his wisdom on display over and over and over. A man with his short-term memory, as soon as he gets 5 minutes past it, forgets. You know, they were fed, they were taken care of. But it was never good enough, or they quickly forgot it and wanted something else. All right, let's go on to verses 11, 12, and 13 here. Verses 11, 12, and 13. It says, the Pharisees came and began to argue with him, demanding of him a sign from heaven to test him. Sighing deeply in his spirit, he said, why does this generation demand a sign? Truly I tell you, no sign will be given to this generation. Then he left them, got back into the boat, and went to the other side. So now, not only can you detect Jesus a little frustrated with the disciples, now he's frustrated with people. He's shown them all this, and they still want more. Now, for seeking a sign, the Pharisees come to Jesus seeking a sign from heaven to test him. Do they, as we've seen earlier going through the Mark, do they usually have the purest of motives in heart? Never. The Pharisees aren't really looking for an honest thing. They're just looking for any opportunity. They're trying to make Jesus prove, or to hang him or to trap him. There is nothing honest about what they're trying to do. Well, one is because Jesus is a threat to their way of religious structure, religious power. So they're not really honestly looking for something here. But think about this. They ask him for a sign. Jesus has done plenty of miracles in front of them, hadn't he? Haven't they witnessed? Haven't they seen a lot of the things he's done? They've heard about a lot of the things he's done. So why are they requesting a sign? So something's going on here. Something's going on. If they're aware of what he's done and have heard what he's done and seen what he's done, and now they're asking for something, something seems suspicious. Something's going on. They want Jesus to do something for them on their terms to prove who he really is. They want something on their terms. Stop here a minute. Jump forward a couple of thousand years. Does man today still want Jesus on their terms? Do we want to see who Jesus is on our terms, based on our needs, based on our wants, based on our situation? Do we want Jesus to do something to prove who he is to us based on what we need? Yeah. We want faith on our ground. So they're wanting Jesus to do something, but they're wanting him to do it on what they want, what they see as need. And in verse 12, it talks about Jesus sighs deeply in his spirit and said, why does this generation demand a sign? Truly no sign will be given to this generation. What's he talking about here? No sign will be given to this generation. You know, there have been signs. And let's talk a little bit here about the Pharisees. If anybody should have recognized by what was going on who Jesus was, who should it have been? Pharisees and the scribes should have recognized he fulfills this, he fulfills this, he fulfills this. Oh, this might be him. If anybody should have known and recognized who Jesus was based on what was going on, it should have been them, and they didn't. And here by this point, by everything that's happened and everything that we've seen already in the Gospel of Mark, there's nothing else he can do to prove to them. He's done it. They should see it. And that's what I think Jesus is getting to here. There's no more signs. You're not going to believe anything I can do or say that will prove to you who I am. He didn't fit their mold. He didn't fit their mold. So no more signs, No signs are going to be given to you because you've seen everything you should have to see to know. One writer said, this is consumer Jesus. We use Jesus for what we get out of him. This is what the Pharisees are doing. They want Jesus to perform for them. They want Jesus to keep doing something for them on their terms. Do we try to live our faith this way sometimes today? Does the world, or even are there Christians who want to live for Jesus, but they want to live for Jesus on my terms? I don't want to live for Jesus on his terms. Problem is, it doesn't work out that way. It doesn't work that way. These are scholars of the law, like I said, who should have been able to recognize and accept the signs of fulfilled prophecies. There shouldn't have been any need for any more sign at this point. Yes, they're in charge. And remember, what we see about the Pharisees through time is it's all about retaining power for them. They have put themselves, quote, into bed with Romans so they can stay in the position of religious power within Judaism. So it's all about maintaining status and power. Sometimes we simply bring this forward. Sometimes we simply evaluate worship and the church from a consumer point of view. What am I talking about here? What do I get? We get caught up in, when we look at consumer church, consumer Jesus, we get caught up in, what did Jesus do for me? What did worship do for me? How many of you have ever heard someone say, well, I just didn't get anything out of going to church today? I just don't know. Sermon didn't jive with me. Singing just didn't hit a note with me. I just didn't get anything. I'd been better to stay home and watch the Olympics on TV this morning. Ever heard somebody say that? Was this worthy of my time? We are a busy culture today. We are go, 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 go. And we a lot of times look at everything we do and we look at it under this eye of, was it worthy of my time? Now, there are a lot of things we do in life we should really look at and say, is it worthy of allocating my time to? But as it comes to spiritual matters, should we have this question? Is there anything ultimately more worthy of our time than serving Him and worshiping Him? Because one of these days, time stops. And what we did with the time we had will be truly the most important thing we've done. So was it worthy of our time? We get caught up in that. And was this worth my effort? I'm busy, I'm tired, sometimes I ain't got energy. Was it worth my time and energy? When it comes to matters of faith and matters of service to the Father, to the Lord, it's always worthy of our time and it's always worthy of our effort. Not everything else we do in life is going to be, but those two are. But sometimes we, as Christians, get too caught up in, well, I've got this and I got that to do. Is it really going to, I don't know if I can squeeze in time to go today. Those are the things we get caught up in when we're looking at consumer religion. Is it worth it? Instead of getting caught up in all those questions, we should be considering what we are giving to God and what we are giving to others. Because as it comes down to how we're supposed to walk our walk of faith, where are we supposed to rank on the list? Where am I supposed to rank on my list? God first, others second, then us. So we need to consider, as we're looking at, if we get caught up in consumer religion, we need to look at, what am I doing? What am I giving? You know, we've had speakers come here before and talk about when people say, what am I getting out of worship? Well, first of all, what are you putting in? What are you putting into it? What are we putting in to our service for Him and to our service for others? We got to avoid getting caught up in consumer religion. Yes. Yeah. Yes. And our great example is the Lord, because if you look at Him, if it had been all about Him, He wouldn't have gone to the cross. Because He knew that how people were going to respond. People had responded. He had seen how people responded to Him. He knew how people were going to respond in the future. You know, most of us would have looked at that situation and said, I'm not going to die for these people. But it wasn't about Him in that case. All right, let's roll up to verse 14. Verse 14. The disciples had forgotten to take bread and only one loaf with them in the boat, and had only one loaf with them in the boat. When He gave them strict orders, watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. They were discussing among themselves, they did not have any bread. Aware of this, He said to them, why are you discussing the fact you have no bread? Don't you understand or comprehend? Do you have hardened hearts? Do you have eyes and not see? Do you have ears and not hear? And do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of leftovers did you collect? 12, they told Him. When I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many baskets full of pieces did you collect? 7, they said. And He said to them, don't you understand yet? It's at this point, don't you wonder if Jesus looks at them and it feels like they're never going to get it? You know, they hear Him talking about leaven. They don't get the message He's trying to convey. All they can think of is, we ain't got no bread. Jesus hears them here talking about, well, we ain't got no bread. And Jesus goes, wait a minute, didn't you just see? If your true need here was to have food, I got that covered. In fact, he asked them how much was left over, and they said this much. And he's trying to get to the point of them that it's abundantly, he'll take care of the needs, but they're not seeing what he's trying to get them to teach them. Most of us would have, at this point, start throwing people overboard. Nope, you're not going to get it. See ya. The frustration, begins to pile up here. But he gives them a warning. A warning. The disciples here are sort of in this mode. I still don't understand. They're not getting it. Now, until the day of Pentecost, they really don't get a whole lot still, do they? Until they get some help, they really don't get it. They don't understand. Jesus is giving important spiritual teaching, and the disciples completely miss it. They start talking about how they forgot to bring any bread because Jesus said the word leaven. They hear leaven, they think bread. They're not getting what Jesus is teaching them here. He's trying to point out, don't let these little influences come into your faith because they can cause great big problems. But they're not getting it. They're not seeing it. The disciples have eyes but do not see, and have ears but do not hear. They have eyes but they do not see. They have ears but they do not hear. They've seen all that Jesus has done. And they're still not getting it. They've heard, but they're still not getting it. He's not getting them to where they need to be yet. Do we sometimes miss the whole point of a spiritual discussion by getting stuck on some little word or phrase? Do we sometimes get caught up on a jot or a tittle and miss the message? You know what? This is one of the great problems with legalistic points of view. You get caught up on the minuscule details and you miss the message. As we've gone through the Gospel of Mark so far, how many times have we seen this among the Pharisees and the scribes? They're trying to hold up to the little bitty parts, the little bitty words, and they're missing the overall message. Do we ever get caught up on trying to hone in on little bitty things and we miss the big picture? And I think sometimes today the answer is still like it was for the disciples then. Yeah. Sometimes we miss out because we're focusing on the wrong thing. We do sometimes miss it. Writer said the problem is that we get so stuck in our world and cares that we're deaf and blind to God. The disciples are anxious about a lack of bread, but Jesus is concerned here about their yet lack of faith. When he says leaven, he's not talking about the actual bread. They hear leaven and they just, oh, we got no bread. Well, you're missing it. The teachings of the Pharisees and the Herodians service something here that could easily distract the people and potentially even the disciples from God's truth. So he's warning them, don't get caught up in some of these little things that are wrong because they can affect the big picture. The warning is still the same for us today. Don't get caught up in little things that are off track with God's message. Don't get caught up in the little things that really don't mean anything, because then we miss the big picture and we get distracted from the things that we should be focused on. And that is one of the devil's great tools. If he can get us focused or arguing on something that is irrelevant, he can take us away from the big picture. And he can keep us off focus and distracted from the things that we ought to be doing individually and collectively as Christians. And so the warning here is don't get distracted. For those who break bread, how much does it take to get the thing going? How much leaven does it take? Not much. It doesn't take but a little to cause big problems. Problem with things of faith is usually it's not the great big things that causes problems. It's the little things. I've used this illustration in other places. Sometimes it's like this. We're trying to walk a straight line of faith. We come up to an issue and we say, okay, to agree to this, I got to step just a little bit off. But I'm not going to be very far from where I was, so I'll do that. So then I'll go a little way. Something else comes up. Oh, it's just a little bit. I'll step off. What happens if you step off a little bit several times? You're suddenly far off the path you started on. And that's how Satan works. If he can get us to vary this much, once, twice, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times, suddenly he's got us way off the path and he's won. Don't let little things that are not important affect your walk and your service to God. The problem is we get the disciples here weren't getting it, and they were getting caught up in the little things. Don't get caught up in the little things. Because ultimately, if you get caught up in little distractions, they lead to bigger problems. All right, let's go to verse 22. We're going to see another instance of a healing here. Verse 22 through 26. They came to Bethsaida. They brought a blind man to him and begged him to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and brought him out of the village. Spitting on his eyes and laying his hands on him, he asked him, "Do you see anything?" He looked up and said, "I see people. They look like trees walking." And Jesus Jesus placed his hands on the man's eyes. The man looked intently, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Then he sent him home, saying, "Don't even go into the village." All right, so another healing of a blind man. But I think in this four short verse passage, there are some powerful things that we can take out of this. As we talk about look again. It appears that Jesus wishes the men to understand that he is there to heal them. As we look at this man and the man that he healed previously, where he took him away from the crowd, it appears that Jesus wishes the man to understand he is there to heal them and that his healing relationship is between him and them. It's not dependent on the surrounding group of people. Because it does make you wonder, we've had these instances of public healings in front of big crowds, but we now see a couple where Jesus takes a man aside. And I think a little bit thing we can take from this is our relationship with God is not based on a group setting. Our relationship with God is a personal thing. And so it's between us and God. And I think Jesus is pointing out here in a way that the relationship with him is important. One-on-one. And our relationship with him is not dependent necessarily on a group setting. The writer says the Bible doesn't say why some healings are immediate and some take a little time. One possible reason is the more involved healings provide a metaphor for the spiritual healing of his disciples. You ever look at this stretch right here and wonder why Jesus had to do something twice? You know, the first time Jesus touches him, after that the man says what he sees? Trees. I can see people, but they look like trees. This isn't a case. Did Jesus make an oopsie here? Oops, didn't put enough power on this healing. Could Jesus have healed this man with one touch if he wanted to? Could Jesus have done it with one touch? Yeah. But Jesus knew he's going to heal this man. So he does it in a two-phase. And I think this is to make a powerful message. But he does it at first, and the man can begin to see, and he can see trees. And then Jesus says, hold on. Sometimes it takes us a little while to see things of faith clearly, doesn't it? And maybe this is also pointing out to the disciples, we're getting you there. Because they don't see it clearly yet either, do they? They haven't got it all figured out. So maybe this is a metaphor for the disciples coming along. They're seeing it, but they don't see it clear yet. Clearly, the term clearly is from the Greek word telagos, and actually means at a distance. It may mean that Jesus' first action made the man nearsighted, and the second brought his full vision back. In this metaphor about spiritual progress, this healing could provide an even acuter metaphor of the disciples' spiritual maturity. They're coming along. They have decided to follow Jesus, but as we can see from their discussion about the bread and the leaven, they don't quite have it yet. But they're seeing more clearly than they did from the day that they began to follow Jesus. But they're going to see it eventually very clearly, clearly enough to the point that they will lay down their lives for His cause. But they're not quite there yet. They're not quite seeing it clearly yet. Even as they are about to affirm Jesus as the Messiah, Peter is going to do that coming up here shortly. Their vision in regards to who the Messiah is really is nearsighted. Because at this point, what do they believe the purpose of the Messiah is? Overthrow Rome. Get the oppressors off. We've had a long history with Romans or some other countries oppressing us. The Messiah is going to put us back to our position of prominence. We're going to be the top dog in the world again, and we're not going to be oppressed by anybody. Their view of the Messiah is an earthly Israel leader, worldly Israel leader. He's going to shake Rome. Because right now, most of the Jews can only think about getting rid of Rome. Got to get the Romans out of here. This is awful. That's their short-sighted view of who the Messiah is supposed to be. But they're not quite seeing it yet. Now, so as we get coming up to Peter's declaration, before we do that, Jesus tells this man here, after he heals him, don't even go into the village. You know, we've had a couple of instances where Jesus tells them, don't say anything. They usually do anyway. But why again does Jesus not want this to get out? Why does He not want this to get out? Doesn't He want people to understand who He is? Doesn't He want people to see who He is, what He can do? The problem we see earlier in the book of Mark is what? Every time Jesus does something, some miraculous thing, what happens? He gets swamped with people. And at one point, aren't they ready to take Him and put Him into power forcefully? Worldly power forcefully. The problem with it getting out so much of what He's doing is that people are going to try to take Him away from His purpose. Is Jesus' true purpose here why He came to cast off Rome? No. That's not why He came. And so Jesus is trying to keep being able to teach and get His disciples to be able to teach others so that everyone can understand why His true purpose is. And if too much word gets out about this healing, He's going to be, as Barbara said, swamped. You know, they got to be so bad that they couldn't get in a house. This is something we need to learn how to accept, writer said. Jesus is more interested in teaching us spiritual truths and sanctifying our hearts than making our lives easier. He will sometimes provide healing or smooth the way through a tough situation, but he'd much rather develop our faith so that we are able to glorify God no matter what we face. The healings were a way to confirm who he was. They were not his purpose, his sole purpose. His purpose was to come and to die on our sacrifice for our behalf so that our relationship with God could be restored and that we could have eternal hope. The most important thing is to teach us how to live to follow him and that we can glorify the Father. Yeah, sometimes he does bail us out of things and helps us through things, but the most important part of that is our relationship with him. That is the most important thing. Here, Jesus is reflecting three conditions that exist. As we've talked about the disciples and their status, we've got about 3 or 4 minutes. Here, Jesus is reflecting three conditions that exist in this situation. One, there's blindness. Blindness. The Pharisees are blind. They do not see anything that Jesus is doing. They're all about consumer Jesus, like we talked about. They're all about consumer Jesus. They just want God for what he can do for them. There are people in the world today that say, oh, if I could have God as a consumer God, I would follow him and do anything I could. Problem is, it's not about us, it's about him and what he wants. It's not about what we want or desire, it's about what he requires. What Jesus is declaring is that making Jesus come to you on your terms is spiritual blindness. If you're going to follow Jesus, but you're going to follow him based on what you want, you are in a state of spiritual blindness. We are no different than the Pharisees in that case. 2, in addition to blindness, there is the can't see clearly category. This is the condition at this point of the disciples. They can see somewhat, but can't see clearly. They're following Jesus, but they're spiritually dull as they still lack understanding. They are seeing what Jesus is doing, but they're failing to see what it means. Sometimes as Christians today, I think we still suffer from this. We can see what God can do. We can see what God is doing, but we don't grasp why he's doing it. The disciples, they're following Jesus. They want to be with him. They want to learn from his teachings, but they don't quite see what it's really all about. The writer said this is the gradual process of faith in the life of the disciples. Though these disciples have begun the journey, but choosing to follow Jesus, they have much to learn. There is a long road of learning ahead. And then the third category is the category of can see clearly. The miracle here shows the journey the disciples were on and that we are on in our faith. We may not see it clearly now, but sometime we will see it clearly. We must not be satisfied with seeing Jesus in a blurry way. Our desire should be to see him and live for him more clearly every day. Jesus did not come so that we can kind of see. Jesus came so that we would have spiritual sight and spiritual understanding. That's why he came. He doesn't want us to just partially see what he was about. He wants us to understand why he came. And with that and with the time, we will stop there for this week.